Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our webinar, Step-by-Step Lesson Planning Using Universal Design for Learning, presented by Dr. Patti Ralabate. My name is Sharon Larkin, and I'll be your moderator for today. I'm a Senior Marketing Manager at Brooks Publishing, who is our proud sponsor for today's webinar. Before I turn it over to Dr. Ralabate, I just want to go over a few quick things. First, Brooks Publishing is offering a special 20% off discount on Dr. Ralabate's new book. To get this discount, you just need to be sure to purchase the book at brookspublishing.com. Here it is. And use the promo code EdWebPR at checkout. The discount on this is good until September 3rd. We are offering CEU certificates for today's webinar. If you're logged into the live webinar, your certificate will be emailed to you within 24 hours. If you're tuning in today by phone or watching the recording, you will need to take the CE quiz, and you can find that quiz in the webinar archives folder in the Teaching All Students community. And to join that community, there is a link there on that slide, and just go to edweb.net/inclusive education. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Patti Ralabate. In addition to being the author of the new book, Your UDL Lesson Planner, the step-by-step guide for teaching all learners, she also teaches at George Washington University in Cast. In 2011, she completed a Boston College postdoctoral UDL Leadership Fellowship, then worked as Cast Director of the National Center on UDL. She has over 25 years of experience in teaching in Connecticut, and she served as Senior Policy Analyst for the National Education Association. Dr. Ralabate, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, and thank you to Regina and the EdWeb team and Sharon and Sophie of Brooks Publishing for your assistance in putting this all together, and for the opportunity to share this webinar with all of these wonderful folks from all over. A little shout out to the folks from Connecticut. It's great to see you here. We're going to get started with just a quick opportunity for you to think about your own personal learning goals for this session. I believe that learning is far more meaningful if you're actually focused on what you want to learn. So I want you to take a moment to define what you might want to learn during this session, this next hour. The learning goals that I set for this webinar include two in particular. One is that the participants will understand how Universal Design for Learning, UDL, can be applied to instruction, and that participants will learn strategies they can use to enhance their current lesson planning process. So think about those two goals that I might have set out, and think about your own personal learning goals for a moment before we get started. To help focus you and to help focus me during this webinar, it would be helpful if you would be willing to take a poll here as we get started. And I think that Sharon will be pulling the poll up. If not, I will do it. There it is. Yay. So the poll is about what is your understanding of Universal Design for Learning. Just click on the little bubble that fits your current learning, and that'll help us all to focus on how much of an explanation I need to give as we get into the meat of lesson planning using UDL. And I'll be quiet for a moment so that you can think about your personal learning goal and the poll. Okay, so it looks like we're starting to ceiling out a little bit, and from the results of the poll, it looks like we've got almost 50% of you that know about UDL, Universal Design for Learning, and almost a third of you, or more than a third of you, that have never heard of it before. So that's very helpful for me, and it'll also be helpful for everybody else on this webinar when they hear me going into explanations that they think are redundant from what they already know. I'm going to close the poll now, so that we can get moving with the content. I want you to meet Maria. Her name could be anything, but For now, her name is Maria, and she just attended a workshop on Universal Design for Learning in her district. She's interested in applying UDL to her instructional planning, but she's not sure where to start. Okay, I get this, she says, but now how do I do it? What should be my next step? What should be my first step? These are the kinds of questions that I heard a lot while I was working for CAST as the Director of Implementation. I conducted many workshops with my colleagues there that explained what UDL was. But toward the end of the workshops, inevitably, someone would say, okay, I get it, just like Maria did, but now how do I do it? And I realized that we needed to provide people with some idea of how to actually apply UDL to their lesson planning structures. And that's why I wrote, this, wait a minute, there it is, this book, Your UDL Lesson Planner, the step-by-step guide for teaching all learners. And that link there will take you directly to the website page for the book. My purpose in writing the book was frankly to explain what UDL was, but also how to use 6 steps to apply UDL to lesson planning. And these are the 6 steps. First, define flexible, clear, SMART learning goals. Second, consider the impact of learner variability. Third, determine meaningful, informative assessments. Fourth, choose effective instructional methods, materials, and media that add value. Teach the lesson, and all the while that you're teaching the lesson, assess what the students are actually learning and how well they're learning. And then finally, refine your future lessons through reflection on the effectiveness, the data that you've accrued through this lesson, so that you can enhance your instructional practices. Those are the 6 steps. Now, before we get into explaining what those 6 steps are, I want to see how well these 6 steps might align to the lesson planning processes you're already using. I did see in our poll that about 15% of you are already applying UDL to your lesson planning. How well do these 6 steps seem to jive? What I would ask you to do is, using a fist to 5 or a 1 to 5 kind of scale in the chat, put a 1 if you're really, this is brand new to you and you're really going to be struggling with just the basics, or 5 if you feel pretty confident that it aligns with what you're already doing. Yeah, okay, we see all numbers all over the place here. Look at them all. Wow, that's great. Okay. So I'm seeing a lot of 3s and 4s. That's terrific. Some 2s and 3s, a couple of 5s, a few 1s. So this aligns pretty closely, it sounds like, with what you're already doing. May seem like a lot to consider 6 steps in, that's the usual thing that I hear from people, but I usually recommend that you take 1 step at a time as you're thinking about making change to what you're already doing with your lesson planning. And if you, for example, feel that your definition of learning goals and how you do that, how you develop your learning goals is really pretty solid, then you may want to move on to a different step and focus on that one. You don't have to do this in order. You can do it in any order that works for you. Let's first talk about developing our learning goals. Now, our lesson or learning goals need to be based on standards. If you work in the United States, and I would imagine in most other places, you should be basing your lessons on some standard system. It might be Common Core or some other standards that your state has developed. And your standards actually give you your purpose. That's what you derive your purpose from. Standards are not your goals. You derive your purpose for your lessons from the standards. Learning goals should focus, our experts tell us, on what learners need to know or understand, or what they need to be able to do. They don't focus on what the teacher's going to do. I found that backward design or understanding by design, which is a curriculum framework that's been out for a while, works really well. It aligns very well with UDL. So if you're currently using that kind of design for your lesson planning process, I think you'll see that this fits really well with that. Now, take a look at the questions there in that yellow box. As you think about your learning goals, you can ask these 3 questions as a quick check on your learning goals. Can my learners articulate a clear purpose, an endpoint to this lesson? That's really important. Starting your lesson by stating the learning goal at the beginning of the lesson, or asking students to state it or to read it, tunes them into what your expectations are. Just having it on the blackboard and never mentioning it is not as effective as if it would be if you actually asked them what the goal is or you told them what the goal is. Secondly, ask yourself, how will I know if they learned what I'm trying to teach them? That is really important as you're designing your learning goals, because it forces you to keep assessment in mind as you're writing your goals. And we'll talk more about that as we get into the webinar. And the third question is, are my learning goals flexible enough to offer options through choice and scaffolds to engage learners and ensure that everyone can achieve the lesson goals? And we'll talk more about that as we move on. Frankly, I believe very strongly that well-constructed learning goals allow every learner to succeed. So how do we ensure our learning goals are flexible? Well, I believe that one way to look at it is to consider using flexible verbs, what I call flexible verbs. And here on this slide, you'll see typical verbs that are used to construct learning goals in English language arts and mathematics. I want you to take a minute and scan through these verbs or actions and think about which ones you think are more constrictive in nature, ones that only allow for a limited performance or action by your students, a specific action by your student, and may not allow you a lot of flexibility, or them a lot of flexibility in how they might show you what they've learned. Think about that for a minute as you're looking at these. And if you happen to see a couple of the verbs that you think are more constrictive, you can write them into the chat. So that we're all clarify. You think is more constrictive? State. Yes, I see Kara from Maryland is saying state. Write, read. Yes, Samantha. Yes, absolutely. And add, multiply, those processes, mathematical processes. Yeah, let's take a look. These are the ones that I think are more constrictive. Sometimes your standards require you to teach these specific skills, right? You're teaching writing, you're teaching reading, and so that is the expectation. And you have to use, or you'll find it necessary to use these more restrictive or constrictive verbs when you write your goals. But if that's not what your standard is requiring, then why complicate the learning by requiring kids to do things in a certain way when you could use a word like compose instead of write, or express instead of state, which allows kids more flexibility, and it allows you more flexibility in terms of how you're going to assess their learning. Another idea to consider in writing your learning goals is making them SMART. Now, many states and districts are now requiring educators to develop SMART goals. You may work in a district that or a state that has already offered workshops about what SMART goals are and how to write them. This acronym, SMART, is really a vehicle, a technique for us to help us remember what the key aspects of good learning goals are. And do you know what the SMART acronym stands for? If any of you want to put that in, I see a couple of people, Terry from Nevada, saying that they have to write SMART goals. Anybody know what it stands for? There you go. Okay. Yep. Absolutely. People are putting it in now. Specific, measurable, attainable. Somebody else said achievable. Very, very similar concept. Results oriented, meaning that you're focused on what the students are doing and what the results are that you're going to be looking for, as opposed to what the teacher's going to be doing. And time or time bound, meaning that your expectation is that by the end of the lesson or by the end of the week or by a certain time, they will be able to show that they've learned whatever this new content is. By using the SMART acronym, we can develop flexible, clear learning goals that are also meaningful and measurable. Oops. Oh, okay. I'm hitting my next button a little bit too hard and it keeps jumping ahead. But here are some examples of some good goals, but they're not SMART. They're not so SMART. And I think one of the first things you'll see in the goals that are written on the right-hand side is that they include constrictive verbs, right? Read, write, state. So that one way to make them more flexible and SMART would be to change those verbs to more flexible verbs, more flexible actions. Why don't you take a look at these goals and see if you can choose one and try to rewrite it in your mind, or you can put it in the chat if you'd like. How can we make these goals a little smarter? More specific, more measurable, more attainable, more results-oriented, and more time-bound. There you go. I've got a nice one there. Learners will compose a story. Great. Absolutely. Express instead of state. Absolutely. Great. Using the words define, construct. Oh, I love it. You guys are so smart already, right? Well, here's a few of my my attempts to make these goals smarter. That's learners will identify at least 10 vocabulary words. That allows you to make it very specific using contextual sentence cues. That helps and provides an assist, a scaffold for those students who might have some difficulty. And then in certain book, in 8 out of 10 trials, see that makes it measurable then. And the other goals here are also more specific, more measurable, more attainable because they provide assistance to those students who might struggle with them through scaffolds, more results oriented, focus totally on what learners will be able to do, and finally, time bound. All of these give you a certain amount of time or measure when the students are expected to have achieved these in some way. So basically, you have a choice in my mind when you're writing your learning goals. Use a flexible verb, and when you can't, add a scaffold. The scaffolds can be all kinds of supports or assistance that you build into the lesson that any student can choose to use should they need it. And that's the piece about making it flexible. You don't want to put a scaffold in the goal and everybody has to use it. If they don't need to use sentence strips or pictures in order to accomplish a certain goal, they should have the choice or flexibility not to use it. But for those kids who do, and we have lots of those kids who do need that kind of scaffolding or assistance, then it's there, and you're taking it into account as you write your goal. Some other examples of scaffolds are providing a model, providing a cue or a prompt, using a guide or a structured worksheet or a template. Those are all types of scaffolds that can be provided and allow students to have assistance as well as meet the same goal as what's available for everybody else. Here are 10 questions that I like to use to reflect on my learning goals. They summarize the important considerations that we need to keep in mind as we're writing learning goals. And you can use them as a quick check to review your learning goals once they've been developed. Now let's take a look at the second step in the learning lesson planning process, and that is considering variability. Variability is a big piece of using UDL, Universal Design for Learning, in your planning. Now, most of you said, clear majority of you said that you know about UDL, and about 15% of you are using it in your planning. So you are probably pretty familiar with this representation. It's the newest representation from CAST of the UDL principles and guidelines. And I just want to do a quick overview for those folks who've never seen this before and they don't know what I'm talking about. We use basically 3 types of networks in our brain when we're learning. The affective networks, which are in the center of the brain. Look at this representation towards the left, the green area that you'll see in the center of the brain are the affective networks, and those really control our emotions, our attention to task, our engagement in the learning situation, are the why of learning. There are 3 guidelines under that brain there, and they all relate to the principle which is listed at the top, to provide multiple means of engagement. Principle, one of the principles, the UDL principles. And you'll see that in the color green, bolded, there are 3 guidelines under that principle. Provide options for self-regulation, provide options for sustaining effort and persistence, and provide options for recruiting interest. So that's sort of how these guidelines are structured. Moving to the center, in the purple area, you'll see the recognition networks, which are in the back of the brain. This is how we receive or perceive information and how it's represented in our learning and how we assign meaning to it. So the principle that addresses the recognition networks is the multiple means of representation, the representation principle. And you'll see there the 3 guidelines underneath that that are highlighted and bolded. And then the third principle really addresses the strategic networks, so the networks that we use that are in the front of the brain that help us to organize our learning, to express and communicate what we know. And those, as I said, are networks that exist within our organizational system, the part of the brain that helps us to organize and express ourselves. And the UDL principle that addresses the strategic networks is the principle of action and expression. And then you'll see there underneath that particular principle on the right-hand side, the 3 bolded, highlighted guidelines that address the principle of action and expression. Now, that's what most people know about UDL, and that's usually where they start. Some people don't know that these guidelines are organized in a way so that they build learning from the bottom up, literally from the bottom up. So the guidelines that are across the three principles on the bottom are all about how we access information, how we perceive information. The guidelines that are sort of in the middle, across the middle, for all three principles are really about how we process new information, assign meaning to it, interact with new information. Sort of when I was a speech and language pathologist, we always talked about processing. Well, this is where the processing takes place. And then finally, the ones that are at the top, building from being able to process the information, what do you do with it next? Well, now you have to generalize it, you have to internalize it, you have to integrate it with other things that you know, and you have to be able to apply it to new situations. So the guidelines that are across the top for all three principles are those guidelines that help us to build higher order learning, or whatever it is that you might have heard it called before, that real learning that allows us to generalize and transfer our learning to the next lesson, to the next curriculum area that we're studying, the next unit. If you need to know more about UDL, I highly recommend Dr. Louis Lord Nelson's book. It's called Design and Deliver, and it is available from Brooks Publishing. It's one of the best resources for learning about UDL that I think exists. If you don't want to buy a book and you want to go and find some free information, go to the National Center on UDL, udl.org. And you will find lots of content that help to explain all of this and more. There's also another way, another aspect of considering learner variability. And the key thing is that all of us are different in how we learn. None of us learns in exactly the same way. And that's why I like UDL and the UDL guidelines so much, because what might be a strength area for you might be a weakness for me, and the same among all your students. But the key thing about UDL is that you can proactively assume that any group, including the group that we have on our webinar today, is experiencing strengths and struggles across the board in some area that's represented on the UDL guidelines framework. Another way to look at variability is that as we're learning, we're also experiencing variability in how we take the information in, move it from working memory to short-term memory to long-term memory. And I like this graphic that shows this brain and how information might be processed from the brain, by the brain, from the beginning of a lesson to the end of the lesson, as you look from the left to the right. First, you need to gain your learner's attention. Then you need to make sure that the content is accessible, making it personally relevant and meaningful. Then, especially with regard to vocabulary and the language you might use, you need to make sure that the language you're using, if you've got any English language learners or kids who struggle with language in any way, you need to make sure that you're providing explanations and vocabulary that is defined for students. Then connecting the new information to something that the students already know. Connecting to their background knowledge, giving them an opportunity then to apply the new information during that same lesson so they don't forget it and you have to go over it all over again when you get to the next lesson. And in the process, by connecting it and applying it, you're helping to move the new information from working memory to short-term memory to long-term memory. And long-term memory means they'll remember it and be able to use it. As you look at the UDL guidelines, you'll find that the guidelines align really well with each of these aspects of lesson design. And I find that this graphic helps me to, as I'm designing lessons like this one, this webinar, and the lessons that I teach for George Washington University and cast that I constantly am thinking about how I'm getting their attention and then moving them to a place where they can actually apply what I'm teaching them. And then finally making it matter by assessing it and making it meaningful to them, making it matter to them, making it matter to me. Okay, so the third step in the UDL lesson planning process is this step of determining assessment. And I mentioned earlier that you need to keep assessment in mind as you're writing your goals. You need to keep assessment in mind as you're thinking about variability, and you need to then choose an assessment that will work for your lesson. And there are lots of flexible assessment techniques that you can use. You can match, and you really need to match your assessment with your clearly defined learning goals, and think about using assessments that are flexible in terms of student choice and meaningful in terms of giving you the kind of information that you really need to know whether or not the students have learned what you're trying to teach them. You also should consider measuring both products and process so that you're not just looking at the final product, but you're also looking at how they got there. That tells us a lot about how meaningful the information really is to them, how much they've assimilated that information. And finally, your assessment should be accessible to all your learners, including your English language learners, your kids with disabilities. It really should be accessible. It should be valid, meaning that you should be measuring what you want to measure. If you're measuring math skills, make sure you're not complicating it by using language that the kids don't understand or the students don't understand. Then in that case, you're measuring language. You're not really measuring math. And you need to make sure that your assessments are unbiased, not culturally biased, not biased in any way, because it affects how your students will perform. Reliability isn't a critical aspect of classroom assessments, but it's very important if you're using a standardized assessment. There's a lot more in the book about assessment. There's an entire chapter on assessment. I'm kind of a bug about assessment, so you might want to take a look at that chapter and see what you can pull out of it that might assist you in your development of assessments. So one assessment mechanism that works really well, I think, with lesson planning based on UDL is the use of rubrics. And here's an example of a rubric. It comes from rubistar.teachers.org, I think it is. And it's a simple kind of rubric that you can use for reading. Many people use rubrics now in higher ed. I use them all the time for my teaching at George Washington University. I think one of the advantages to a rubric is that it gives students your expectations, and they can choose what level they want to perform at. It also eliminates the arguments that you might have about more subjective kinds of assessments, because it's very clear if you write a really good rubric what it is that you expect them to do. I'm curious, I see a couple of people saying that they love rubrics. Well, I'm kind of curious about that. Let's stop for a moment, let you think about what you've heard so far about the first 3 steps in the lesson planning process. Defining clear, smart learning goals, the impact of learner variability, using meaningful, informative assessments. What do you think about that right now? Up or down? Thumbs up, thumbs down? What do you think? Oh, look at all these ups. I love it. That's fabulous. Good for you. Okay, great. And it sounds like you like rubrics too. Okay, makes me happy. Here are 10 questions that you can use to reflect on your assessments for your lessons. They offer a summary and a quick check for your lessons. And They emphasize the ideas that we talked about before, as well as things like making sure that you minimize anxiety and distractions, that you use balanced scaffolds, that you offer incentives and choice, an opportunity to correct errors. All of those are ideas around flexible classroom assessments that help to make your assessments more effective and more relevant to your teaching. The next step and the fourth step in the UDL planning process involves infusing the UDL strategies, the UDL guidelines into your teaching methods and adding materials and media that add value to your lesson. Now, take a look at where that sits in the UDL lesson planning process. Oftentimes people go first and they think, well, I'm going to do a discussion, or I'm going to do a case-based study, or I'm going to, and they negate the first three steps in the process of really thinking about, what's your goal? What do you really want to accomplish? How are you going to address the learner variability that exists in your classroom, in your learners, in the lesson itself? How are you going to assess it and make sure that you know that the students have actually learned what you want them to learn? So the fourth step, in my mind, doesn't come until after you've done those things. And it really involves infusing those UDL strategies into whatever teaching method you decide to use. Here are 10 of the top teaching methods used in the United States. Most of these you're familiar with, I'm sure. I'm sure you're going to start to write in the chat, oh, I love, reciprocal teaching or whatever it is. These teaching methods are favorites among teachers. And all of them are ones that you can infuse UDL strategies into. The book actually offers examples of how to infuse UDL strategies into each of these 10 teaching methods. But let's take a moment to just look at two. I picked direct instruction or lecture and discussion because those are ones that we're all pretty familiar with and many of us use. This is a lecture, what I'm doing right now with this webinar. And yet what I've been trying to do through the webinar and will continue to try to do is to model and show how UDL techniques or strategies can be infused even in a lecture situation. So think about which UDL guidelines, which strategies you think might be useful if you're developing a lesson that is reliant on direct instruction or lecture. Or you could choose discussion, a large group discussion, small group discussion. Think about which guidelines might apply. You don't necessarily have to respond, but just think about them for a moment. Here are some ideas, and I'm loving what you're putting in the chat. That's great. That's great. Here are some ideas around how to infuse UDL strategies into a direct instruction or a lecture. The authorities actually do equate direct instruction and lecture as very similar methodologies. But you can activate background knowledge, you can sustain interest by breaking it into segments. One recent research that I read talks about the fact that if you stop for just a moment and you summarize and you give your learners an opportunity to think about and reflect on what you've said so far, they will remember up to 40% more at the end of your lesson. And so breaking your lecture into segments is a great strategy. Clarifying vocabulary with a glossary, making sure that you give students the opportunity to ask questions, to reflect on what they've learned, particularly through a Q&A at the end, like we're going to do, using bullets, graphics, note-taking guides, different kinds of templates, Note-taking templates are fabulous. And also making sure that you display information in alternative ways. Providing short videos. I learn better from videos, I know, than others. That's one of the reasons why the book has 7 videos in it. Under discussion, these are some of the ideas that I came up with. You might come up with others of examples of how you can infuse the UDL guidelines into a discussion. One of the major errors that often occur is that people just think that students know how to discuss, and they don't provide them with any kind of guide, or so providing a discussion guide with question probes is a great way to structure a discussion and help students to learn how to have an informative discussion, not to have one student dominating everything. Giving organizers and summaries of the content, providing question structures, and certainly offering a choice, having a discussion, and then offering the group an opportunity to summarize without just saying it. Maybe they could put together a little mime, or they can do a poster or something that's not verbal. So there are lots of ways that you can summarize or structure a discussion and infuse the UDL guidelines into that, and take into account the learner variability that will exist within that group that's having the discussion. And I see many of you are putting in some ideas. Good for you. The other piece of methods, materials, and media is adding materials or media that matter. The one thing that I sort of have a little bit of a pet peeve about is that oftentimes teachers will move, when they're first learning about UDL, they move immediately to this idea of infusing media, digital media, technology into their lesson, and they miss those other steps that we've been talking about. And then they might come up with results that say that, gee, I applied UDL, but it didn't make much difference in the lesson. So that's one of the reasons why I think you really need to consider adding media that aligns with your lesson goals, your assessment, with and adds value to it, rather than just kind of saying, well, I want to try this app during this lesson. Here are the 3 principles of UDL: engagement, representation, and action and expression. And there are 3 questions that you can ask yourself as you're choosing media or materials that you want to apply to your lesson. And I'll let you read those. They have to do with, in particular, flexibility, choice, and highlighting critical features. So let's take a moment again and think about what you've heard so far. And again, in the chat, if you could just give us an idea of how all this sounds to you. Does this really help you to collect your thoughts about developing a lesson? A lot of music. Okay, great, great. Now, some of you may feel it's sort of in between. It's a lot to do. Sounds great, but you know, it may be hard to do. I see it as it's scanning by, a few people saying this is validating for you as you're already doing a lot of this. That's fabulous. Good for you. Let's move on to the last couple of slides. The next step, of course, is that you teach your lesson. And while you're teaching your lesson, you make sure that you assess or collect data so that you can evaluate the performance of your students and this effectiveness of your lesson, of course. And remember this process of how you want to take new information and move it into their long-term memory. So think about that as you're teaching. The final step in the 6 steps of UDL lesson planning is the idea of reflecting on your lesson. And you can't do this with absolutely every lesson. I understand that, but you should choose some so that you can actually develop a better understanding and become more of an expert UDL user than you might be now. And the questions on this slide actually offer you a summary of the UDL lesson planning process, and they can be used as a quick check to reflect on your lessons if you're involved in a professional learning community, for example. There's a lot of information in the book about questions that you can use, quick checks at each point in the lesson planning process that you can use and ask each other in your community. You may learn better by viewing a video that shows examples and models, and that's exactly what the 7 videos do. In the first one that you might have seen at the beginning of this, we played it right before the webinar started, is free to anybody. It's easily accessible at the website that will be in the community site. There's also a number of downloadable materials that you can go to at this link here at the bottom of this slide. There are forms and exercises and check-ins that come from the book, and you're welcome to use those. The 6 videos that are aligned with each one of the chapters, when you buy the book, you get a code and you can go to those videos and use those. So in summary, very quickly, I believe that UDL lesson planning is a process of applying the UDL guidelines, a UDL lens, if you will, throughout your lesson planning, beginning with defining a clear, flexible, smart learning goal, to finally reflecting on your lesson's effectiveness in order to enhance your own teaching practice and your UDL expertise. There are lots more resources and examples and models in the book, but hopefully these slides have given you a place to start in applying your UDL to your lesson planning so that you can teach all students, all learners effectively. The one thing I didn't mention early on is that the UDL does not apply just to preschool or K through 12. I use it in higher ed. It applies to any learner group because we all have brains that basically have 3 networks or 3 sets of networks, and the UDL principles apply to all of us as we're learning. I want to thank you for your participation in the webinar, and I know we're going to take a couple of the questions. I know you've been very busy writing questions here, and I've tried not to look because it distracts me, but I'm happy to take any questions you might have and see what we can do with that.
Great. Well, you had a lot of questions, so I'm just going to get started and read you some of them. So on slide 50, a couple of people asked, what is meant by self-regulation? Can you give an example?
Great. Okay. So students really need to be able to have some control or ownership over their own learning, and they can, as you teach them through making sure that they have goals that are meaningful to them, that they develop their own personal goals. That's one of the reasons why I always start any kind of learning, whether it be a webinar or a course or a class that I'm teaching, a workshop that I'm teaching, I always start it with designing your own personal learning goal. It helps to focus you. As adults, we can do that very easily, but we have to teach students how to own their learning and to take ownership for it, that it is their responsibility to learn. It's our responsibility to teach them as well as we can. And so that's really how I would define self-regulation. Sometimes they call it student agency, ownership, learning ownership. There are lots of different terms that are used.
Okay. What is the difference between purpose and goal?
Oh, good question. Great question. The purpose is very general. You know, you want to teach your students about the reasons why the United States had a civil war. But your goal is very specific, as we said, specific, measurable, attainable. It's much more defined. The purpose relates to something that you might pull out of the standards, that the students should be able to know about the Civil War and its impact, or the rationale that the South used for going to war, for seceding. But your goal actually is going to show you what the students are going to, the specific information that they're going to learn, and what they're specifically going to do in order to show you that they've learned it. I hope that helps.
Okay. Another question actually just popped up along the same lines. What's the difference between goal and objective?
Oh, another good question. Goals are a little bit broader, and objectives are the steps that we typically take to get there. So you might have a goal that requires the students to write an essay, and the first objective might be that they be able to pull out the main ideas in the text, that they're writing about. And then the next objective might be that they're able to describe the characters. And then the next, another way of writing objectives is actually to take the information and sequence it in difficulty. It all depends on, what it is that you've been taught to do and the group that you're working with. I worked primarily with special ed, so oftentimes objectives are ones that I would write that would be sequenced in terms of difficulty.
Okay.
And then okay, I'm seeing some responses about objectives. I'd have to look at the chat a little bit more.
Yeah, we can keep going. Okay. Another question that came in, what is the distinction between differentiated instruction and UDL?
Oh, yay! Thank you for asking that question. I was afraid that maybe we wouldn't get to it. Universal design for learning can be used in any situation for any learner group. As I said, differentiated instruction is typically focused on a specific student using data that you have about that student's learning. And so it's one of those things that you do, in my mind, after you've designed your lesson using UDL. Then there may be some students who actually need more than that, more than what you can provide, and you need to differentiate for them specifically. And that's how I view the difference between differentiated instruction and UDL.
Okay, so I do think we have a couple more minutes. We might be able to fit a few more questions in. One person asked, and I think it's important to ask for, especially people who are new to UDL, what is CAST?
Oh, good question too. CAST originally was called the Center for Applied Special Technologies. It was a nonprofit group established by 5 people back in the early 90s. And their original focus was on helping school districts to design curriculum that would be better for kids with severe disabilities. But as they looked in and developed the concept of UDL over time, they found that UDL really is applicable to any learners. And they have shifted their focus a bit over the years. They still exist. They're in Wakefield, Massachusetts. It's a nonprofit. They function basically on grants that they get from different entities. And they do a lot of research on aspects of UDL and student learning.
Wonderful. And the website is just cast.org, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And I think that's in the chat too. We mentioned that earlier. Okay, so next question. Why should a teacher write a goal when a measurable standard is available?
Most standards that I've seen are a little bit too broad for a lesson goal. Now, your standards may be different and they may be measurable in such a way that it does equate to a learning goal or a lesson goal, and that's just fine. But most of the standards that I've seen are actually based on a broad section of learning, and so they're a little bit too broad for individual daily lessons.
Okay. Another question, how are flexible assessments reliable and valid for all students?
Another great question. I do address this in the book, actually. Flexible assessments cannot really be reliable. Reliability means that you give the same assessment to a variety of groups over time and you get the same results. Well, flexible classroom assessments are given once, maybe twice. You don't have the construct that allows them to be reliable. You do want a standardized test to be reliable. You want it to be reliable so that every time it's given, you're going to get basically the same results. But the flexible classroom assessments really aren't structured in such a way that they can be reliable, giving you the same results all the time. And what was the second part of that question? I'm sorry.
How are flexible assessments reliable and valid for all students?
And valid. Okay, so the other idea about validity really means that you're measuring what you believe you're measuring, that you are looking at what it is that you want to measure, and you're ensuring that the assessment specifically focuses on that task, that skill, that piece of knowledge that you want to measure. And oftentimes valid assessments, standardized assessments are not valid. Sometimes some of the assessments that we use in classrooms are not valid because they're actually assessing content that we haven't taught students, where they're using language the students don't know, so that you get an invalid response. You get an invalid performance level from the students.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question before we have to close. It's difficult to pick which one. Back on slide 35, you had up a graphic of the UDL guidelines. And we got a question during that time, which is, should students be classified in one of the three?
Oh, please, no, don't do that. Because these work for all of the principles work for all of us all the time, One of the mistakes that we've done in education, and I'm so glad you asked that question. Thank you for asking that question. That allows me to clarify. One of the mistakes we've made in education is that we've become over obsessed with classifying students, classifying humans. We have a tendency as humans to want to put labels on things and labels on people. And it often is to the detriment of students, because none of us can be described by one term, one label. And our learning is multidimensional. And the UDL guidelines actually do represent that multi-dimensional aspect of learning. There they are, So a student might in one lesson be really strong in their ability to recruit interest. They're really interested in this particular topic, so they're really great in that area. And what they're not so good at for that particular lesson would be being able to activate their background knowledge, or being able to transfer and generalize the information, which is up at the top under representation. So, you really have to engage students or consider the student skills in all of these areas. And I know that sounds overwhelming, but frankly, it is doable.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ralabate. I'm going to just fast forward a little bit. We are at 4 o'clock, so we do have to close. If we didn't get to your question, we'll definitely try and email you an answer. If you have any additional questions, please feel free, for Dr. Ralabate, please feel free to send them to brookswebmeeting@brookspublishing.com, and we will do our best to answer them for you. Also, be sure to write down your discount code, EdWebPR, so you can save 20% at Brooks Publishing on Dr. Ralabate's new book. Also, if you have any questions, like I said before, just feel free to send them to us at brookswebmeeting@brookspublishing.com. Don't forget about your CEU certificate. If you're listening by phone or the recording of this webinar, you will need to be sure to take the CE quiz, and you can find that on the Teaching All Students community page under Web Archives. So be sure to tune in next time. Our next webinar is going to be on September 28th with Dr. Eva Horn, and the topic will be 6 steps to inclusive preschool curriculum. To register for that, again, just go to our community page, Teaching All Students. You can also find additional information there, free content and resources for educators. So that, again, is edweb.net/inclusive education. So again, thank you, Dr. Ralabate, for presenting. Fantastic job. And on behalf of Brooks Publishing, EdWeb, and Dr. Ralabate, thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you to everybody that joined us. Thank you.